Well, it's noon, so I would like to welcome everyone to the Ontario Farmland Trust Lunch, Learn, and Take Action session on lot creation policies in the proposed provincial policy statement. My name is Margaret Walton. I am the Vice Chair of the Ontario Farmland Trust Board of Directors, Chair of the organization's Policy and Education Committee, as well as a Senior Associate at Planscape, a planning consulting firm specializing in rural and agricultural planning. I am also a registered professional planner who has spent my career working to protect our agricultural land base and create the circumstances under which farmers can farm successfully. In this role, I have worked for all farm organizations and federations, all levels of municipal government and the province to establish policies to support the agri-food sector. Great progress was being made. Next slide. For those of you unfamiliar with the Ontario Farmland Trust, we are the only provincial-wide land conservation organization with a mission dedicated to the protection and preservation of Ontario's agricultural land base. Ontario's prime agricultural land is a finite, non-renewable resource that comprises less than 5% of Ontario's land base. Estimates are that only 0.5% of that land base is Class 1. The best we have, and much of it is located in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. Farmland is a literal foundation of the agri-food sector that provides us with locally produced food, employs more than 750,000 Ontarians, that's 1 in 10 of the provincial labor force, are employed in the agri-food supply chain and contributes to over $47 billion annually to the provincial GDP. It is more important now than ever before that we protect our agricultural landscapes and land. Ontario has lost 20% of our farmland in the last 40 years, and the rate of farmland loss nearly doubled between 2016 and 2021 to a rate of 319 acres per day. Once farmland is developed, it is gone forever. Farmland is a non-renewable resource vital to our local food supply. And yet, at a time when we need government action to abate the rate of farmland loss, we are seeing proposed policies that will accelerate the conversion of farmland to non-agricultural use. Next slide. The Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing has proposed a new and amended policies from the province's Place to Grow plan and has integrated them into the provincial policy statement to create a new provincial policy statement, which will act as the framework for Ontario's municipalities' land use planning authorities. OFT is greatly concerned on a significant number of the changes proposed in the new provincial planning statement, including the weakening of policy language that will undermine the implementation of the agricultural systems planning that will lead to inconsistencies in designating prime agricultural areas, and the weakening of the system that farmers require to farm successfully. The removal of the municipal comprehensive reviews that assess settlement boundary expansions to protect agricultural land and minimize the impact of those expansions on the resource. Reducing existing density targets for fast-growing municipalities and removing density targets for the remaining municipalities within the Greater Golden Horseshoe. This will lead to inefficiencies of land use in existing settlement areas and require boundary expansions that may expand onto farmland more quickly. And of course, what we will be focusing on in today's webinar, the requirement for municipalities to permit up to 3 severances on prime agricultural land for residential lot creation. The Ontario Farmland Trust actively comments on changing policy will impact farmland, but we need as many people as we can to engage with their MPPs to bring attention to the potentially devastating impacts these policies will have on our food production sector. In my view, it is a case of unintended consequences. Not all land is equal. Where these policies will have the worst impact is on the prime agricultural land base. For example, a significant amount of the land being removed from the green belt, the Dufferin Rouge Agricultural Land Preserve is the best example, is Class 1 land. We can grow anything on Class 1 land. It is being replaced by marginal land where we cannot grow anything. Similarly, the lot creation policies, as you will hear, are focusing will fragment the land base, push up prices, and eliminate much of the potential for livestock production. I am grateful for everyone who was able to join us today. We hope the session will better equip you so you can take steps to prevent these harmful policies from proceeding. A few logistical comments. We encourage people to share comments in the chat through the presentation. However, please submit your questions to the presenters in the Q&A feature and direct your questions to a particular presenter if appropriate. If you have a similar question already submitted, please upvote that question by clicking the thumbs up icon. This will move the question up in the queue, so we will be able to answer the most popular questions first. We have Martin Stradoff, Executive Director of the OFT, and Tamara Brown, Events and Community Outreach Assistant, who will be providing support during the Q&A session. If you have any technical issues, you can message them directly during the chat feature. And at the end of the session, we will provide you with additional tools to engage in policy discussion and advocacy in each of your municipalities. Today, we have Dr. Pam Duesling and Dr. Wayne Caldwell joining us to provide their presentation on law creation policies and the future of agriculture in Ontario. Pam Duesling is a registered professional planner and economic development professional who has been practicing in rural Southern Ontario for 25 years. Pam formerly worked in both Haldimand County and Norfolk County and is now the General Manager of Development Services in the County of Brant, and serves as a director on the Ontario Professional Planners Institute Council. Pam has a Bachelor of Environmental Studies in Urban Planning and a Master's of Applied Environmental Studies in Local Economic Development from the University of Waterloo. She most recently obtained her PhD in Rural Studies at the University of Guelph. She also holds a diploma in public administration from the University of Western and a master's certificate in municipal leadership from the Schulich Executive Education Center at York University. Pam understands the challenges and opportunities of both rural economic perseverance and agricultural land use planning through her academic and professional work, as well as her personal dedication of being a sixth-generation family farmer in Norfolk County. Wayne Caldwell recently retired as a professor in rural planning at the University of Guelph. He previously served in interim positions as Dean of the Ontario Agricultural College and as Associate Vice President of Research. Prior to joining the university, he worked with the County of Huron Planning Department for many years. His interests include planning for agriculture and rural communities, community economic development, healthy rural communities, and community-based approaches to economic and environmental issues. He has had a specific interest on the impacts of severances in rural communities. He has written or edited a number of books, including Farmland Preservation: Land for Future Generations. He has served as president of the Ontario Professional Planners Institute, as well as chair or president of a number of local, provincial, and national organizations. We are so very grateful to both of you for being here to share your knowledge and expertise on this subject. And so now I will hand it over to Pam and to Wayne.
Great, thank you very much, Margaret, and good afternoon, everyone. I first and foremost want to thank the Ontario Farmland Trust and specifically Tamara, Martin, and Margaret for putting together this webinar on such short notice and providing Wayne and I an opportunity to share with everyone what we know. Wayne is definitely the expert in terms of agricultural severances and the effects to the farming community, and his research over the years has provided valuable information to many of us. So I'm so thankful to be working alongside Wayne. What I can offer as a practicing planner of almost 25 years is a look at the current policy regime for a rural agricultural perspective and introduce my professional understanding and opinion on the proposed legislation. So next slide, please. So to begin, it should be recognized that the province of Ontario has released several legislative changes and new planning policy over the last 3 years. That's greatly changed how land is developed in Ontario. And these legislative changes include More Homes, More Choice Act in 2019, the Place to Grow Act with the revisions of the Schedule 3 forecasts in 2020, the Housing Affordability Task Force report in 2022, Bill 109, More Homes for Everyone Act in 2022, Bill 23, More Homes Built Faster Act in 2022, and most recently, Bill 97, Helping Home Buyers Protecting Tenants Act, and the topic of today's presentation, a new proposed provincial planning statement. Next slide. So the new proposed provincial planning statement was released on April 6th and is currently posted on the Environmental Registry of Ontario for 60 days as a commenting period until June 5th. It should be recognized that the proposed provincial planning statement is proposed to combine and replace the existing provincial policy statement, otherwise known as the PPS of 2020, and a place to grow growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe growth plan, which is established in 2005. So the integration of these two documents into the proposed provincial planning statement is intended to assist the province in creating 1.5 million homes over the next 10 years by 2031. And it's anticipated that a new finalized provincial planning statement will be in effect in the fall of 2023. Next slide. So the focus of today's presentation, as Margaret identified, is specifically to outline the proposed policies of accessory residential units and lot creation in the agricultural area and the anticipated ripple effects of these policy changes. So Wayne and I will specifically be presenting on Chapter 4 of the proposed provincial planning statement, which is entitled Wide Use and Management of Resources. We will not be discussing natural heritage policies located in this chapter, but it should be recognized that currently there's a big yellow box under the natural heritage policy section in the new proposed provincial planning statement that outlines natural heritage policies are forthcoming. Now, we are hearing that these policies will be ready soon to review. However, it is very challenging to review a new proposed provincial planning statement when not all of the policies, which should be read as a whole, are not ready. So at this time, we do not know the natural heritage policies or how they will or will not affect the management of resources, including specifically agriculture. I will bring your attention to specifically section 4.3.2 of chapter 4, which identifies permitted uses in the agricultural area. So a significant change to the uses that are permitted in the agricultural areas is the increase of accessory residential units, otherwise known as ARUs. So through previous legislation, the province has created the ability for 2 ARUs to be permitted in the urban areas. And the new provincial planning statement now identifies the ability for 2 ARUs to also be permitted in agricultural areas, subject to the criteria as outlined on the screen. Now, my professional opinion is that this is not a bad change until the 2 ARU policy is applied to the 3 new severance lot policy, which I'll talk about in a moment. Then it's just simply too much. ARUs are a great way for farmers to create generational succession planning. It creates more family residential opportunities on one property for both children, parents, and grandparents, who all may play a part in succession family farming. And as long as it is a compact development, ARUs can create low carbon footprints and they don't utilize agricultural areas. However, there is a strange policy, 4.3.25, which is located at the bottom of the page and highlighted in the green box. And this policy includes the words, the additional residential units may only be severed from the lot containing the principal dwelling in accordance with policy 4.3.3.1. Now, again, we'll get to policy 4.3.3.1 in a moment, but it's my understanding that the province really needs to clarify the wording of this specific policy. It's not clear what is intended here. Does the policy specifically connect to the principal dwelling as of January 1st, 2023, or are all new principal dwellings to come on the severed new lots? Keep this policy in mind as we look at the rest of the policy changes, and we'll come back to the ARUs and the specific policy in the presentation in a bit. Next slide. So to graphically illustrate ARUs, historically there has been one primary dwelling on an agricultural lot and maybe one ARU, depending on the local municipal policies, as shown on the screen. Next slide. However, the proposed policy will allow 3 total residential units, so the principal dwelling plus 2 additional ARUs as identified on the screen. Now, the other thing that is not clear is if each municipality will be allowed to create their own local municipal policies to confirm the details of the two ARUs. For example, where I work at the County of Brant, we include more details around distance associated with inclusive proximity to, and we also put specific size and scale requirements in our zoning bylaws so that the ARUs are indeed accessory to the principal dwelling and are smaller in size. Next slide. So let's move on to the big news, which is policy 4.3.3 of the new proposed provincial planning statement, which does permit 3 new lots in prime agricultural areas. Yes, that is correct, 3 new lots in prime agricultural areas. So now right off the bat, I'm a bit confused by the wording of this policy. Technically, prime agricultural areas are those that are dominated by prime agricultural lands that have specialty crop areas or class 1 to 3 of the Canadian land inventory, and pockets of class 4 and 7, and those that exhibit characteristics of agriculture. So my question to the province is, are you allowing new lots on prime agricultural lands or all agricultural lands? And this should really be clarified. Then the policy goes on to state that new residential lots can be created from a lot that existed January 1st, 2023, and which agriculture is the principal use of the existing lot. So this next problem is that the policy does not refer to a farm, and neither farm or agriculture are defined in the new proposed provincial planning statement. But agricultural uses is, which is outlined on the screen and includes growing of crops, raising of livestock, etc. So my questions to the province here are, what is meant by agriculture is the principal use of the existing lot? Does this mean that all parcels that are designated agriculture or zoned agricultural meet the definition of agricultural uses? Or simply, is it lots that have an agricultural use on them? Does this include estate lots, rural lots, or those that are 2+ acres in size, as long as they have maybe a garden or a beehive on them? I've worked in rural planning long enough to know that many property owners will be stretching the definition of agricultural uses. The interpretation of agricultural uses needs to be defined and clarified in the context of severances. Next slide. And I apologize, that's looking a little blurry, Margaret, and I'm not sure if everyone else is seeing the blurriness that I am, but I apologize. We can make sure that when we share these slides, they're a bit more clear. Historically, the PPS has aimed to protect agricultural areas for food production and direct non-agricultural development to settlement areas. The current 2020 PPS policies are identified on the left side of the screen, and a track changes version of proposed policy 4.3.3 is identified from Osler on the right side of the screen. And again, outlines the ability to create new residential lots from lots or parcels that are existed on January 1st, 2023, provided that 1, agriculture is the principal use of the existing lot, 2, the total number of lots created does not exceed 3, 3, that residential uses are compatible with and shall not hinder surrounding agricultural operations, 4, a new lot is located outside specialty crop areas, complies with MDS, will be limited to the minimum size needed to accommodate sewage and water services, has public road access with frontage, and is adjacent to existing non-agricultural uses, or consists primarily of lower priority agricultural lands. So again, I have questions. Will the minimum size of these severed lots be left up to each municipality? I recognize that in southwestern Ontario, we utilize a 1 acre for nitrates and groundwater protection. However, other municipalities in, say, Eastern Ontario, for example, utilize a 2 acre limit. The wording has existing access on a public road with frontage. Will this also be left to local municipalities to determine in their zoning bylaws? They each have different standards. And the wording is adjacent to existing non-agricultural uses or consists primarily of lower priority agricultural lands. But what does this mean? What specifically are non-agricultural uses? Is this all and anything that is not defined as an agricultural use? And what does consist primarily of lower priority agricultural lands really mean? Lower than what? Lower than prime ag lands of class 1 to 3 soils? Or does this not relate to soil classification at all? Is it simply wherever a farmer chooses? And how and by whom will lower priority agricultural lands be justified? So many challenges with the wording of these policies. Not to mention specifically proposed policy 4.3.2, which states, official plans and zoning bylaws shall not contain provisions that are more restrictive than policy 4.3.1A, except to address public health or safety concerns. So I will ponder if Ontario food production is a public health concern. For those municipal councils that have historically chosen to be more restrictive in terms of lot creation, such as Oxford County, who has a lot of livestock, will no longer have this opportunity. All municipalities will need to conform to these lot creation policies. Next slide. So what does this lot creation policy look like? Well, here's an example of what agricultural parcels may look like with the 3 new lots created on each. I should also mention that this would also allow the opportunity to still sever a surplus farm dwelling on top of the 3 new lots. Next slide. And this is what it could look like from a concession perspective with 3 new lots on each agricultural parcel. Next slide. I want to thank Middlesex County for putting this slide together of agricultural lots that could sever in the County of Middlesex as the proposed policy comes to fruition. This is astounding. I do want to stress that this is an approximate image and it's based on the information we know as a profession today. Next slide. So in chatting with my colleagues across the province, I'd like to share with you some of the numbers we are hearing as possible new residential lots created on agricultural lands. And again, I want to outline that these are approximate numbers and each municipality is calculating a little differently around interpretation of the proposed policies at this time. So municipalities like Huron County, Middlesex County, Essex County, and Oxford County are all in that 25,000 to just under 20,000 new lots created range. Whereas Norfolk County, Bruce County, Wellington County are all in approximate 15,000 new lots created range. And then Grey County, Northumberland County, Haldimand County, Brant County are anywhere from 10 to 7,000 lots created. So again, this is a mind-blowing number at approximately 160,000 lots. And this is not from all of Ontario. This is just from a few that have provided or done these calculations to date. Next slide. So finally, I want to circle back to that weird ARU policy. So this is an image that again shows the 3 lots created on an agricultural lot. And but this time it includes the ARUs. So ultimately, this means where historically there has been 1 primary dwelling on an agricultural parcel. Now there could be a total of 12 residential units on those same agricultural lands. A primary dwelling and 2 ARUs on each new severed lot, as well as the existing agricultural parcel. Next slide. And then from a concession perspective, this is how many total residents could be created. This illustration shows 135 residential units on the concession. Again, this is astounding. Now back to that weird policy 4.3.25. Does this then mean that each of these ARUs, even on the new lots created, could be severed from their principal dwelling? Again, this policy really needs to be clarified by the province. Next slide. Before I turn it over to Wayne to talk about the effects of this proposed lot creation policy, I have a few further points and questions for you to ponder regarding lot creation policy as it is proposed. 1, has the province thought about the existing farms that currently have zoning restrictions for residents as a result of surplus farm dwelling severances? And will these need to be removed or changed to allow agricultural lots or parcels the same opportunities? 2, how will Ontario rural municipalities implement change as a result of this new lot creation policy? Will municipalities need to hire more planners, and where will these planners come from? There is already a shortage of planners in Ontario, and rural municipalities in particular are already having a hard time attracting planners. So where will there be opportunities for delegating authority so as not to have all severance applications go to Committee of Adjustment? If not, will our Committee of Adjustments to be too busy. And I'm very worried about the mental health and well-being of our rural planning profession in Ontario. Finally, we should keep in mind that as a result of the previous Bill 23, it's my understanding that there are also no opportunities for third-party appeals on severances, meaning that even if these new proposed severances created land use conflicts or normal farming practice conflicts, that there are no opportunities to appeal. So with all that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Wayne to talk about the future of agriculture in Ontario, keeping in mind the new proposed provincial planning statement lot severance policies.
Thank you very much, Pam, and thanks to the Ontario Farmland Trust as well for putting on today's event. And thanks to all of you who are attending to demonstrate your interest and to learn more about this topic. I'd like to begin with an initial story, and it takes me back in time to one of my very first experiences as a planner. I was probably 23, 24 years old, had just graduated from a Western University and was employed by the County of Huron. And we were in the process of developing a new official plan for what that time was the township of East Waminosh. And we went through a series of public meetings. We talked about agriculture, we talked about the natural environment, we talked about the small urban places, and we talked about aggregates and so on. And at the back of the room, at each of these meetings, was a burly, aggressive farmer, stereotyped by the person in front of us here. And he had this ability to heckle and ask tough questions. And as time went by, I have to say that I felt smaller and smaller, but we got through the process of developing that draft official plan, and we worked with the local council in doing so. And of course, we went back to a final public meeting where we presented the content of that official plan. And I see our slides have disappeared for a second here. We presented the content of that official plan. And my friend, the burly, aggressive farmer, was still at the back of the room. But in this instance, he wasn't asking any questions. And I'm thinking, oh boy, he's so angry. He's going to meet me outside after the meeting in the parking lot. But finally, at the end of the meeting, he stands up and he says, "This is a good plan. You listen to what we had to say." Now, there is a story behind the story. The story behind the story is that in that municipality, previously under the county official plan, there were the opportunity to sever surplus dwellings. And there was a property owner, an accountant actually, who was going around and purchasing up properties, and he was severing off the house. He met all of the legal definitions of a farmer. He was severing off the house from the farmland and then selling the two as separate entities. And he did this multiple times over, to the point that the farm community in that municipality was so upset by that they were requesting the municipality to not allow any residential severances. And that's, in fact, folks, what was put into effect in that municipality. There were no residential severances except in the towns and villages. And what I would suggest for you is the policy we have before us in the revised draft policy statement, provincial planning statement, I should say, is tens of thousands of those kinds of opportunities being possible across the province. I think it's a fundamental concern for all of us. It's a fundamental concern for agriculture, and I'd like to share some of the specifics. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So what we have here is just puts in very graphic or photo representation of some of the things that Pam was talking about. And you can see in this slide, which was taken outside of Guelph a few years ago, the historic legacy of a number of severances that occurred. And in this instance, we have 6. Well, imagine, again, that we're looking at that as probably 4 parcels, the worked land, bare land on the bottom left, already having 3 severances off it. Well, it would be able to have another 3 severances off it. The property above that, 3 more, 3 more, 3 more. So in that location, you would have the opportunity for up to 12 additional severances in addition to what's already there, plus 3 dwellings per unit per severed lot established on them as well. Next slide, please. So I tend to do my research. I present at conferences. I don't so much get engaged in social media, but this issue has struck me so strongly that I thought it was really important to put myself out there in terms of putting forth some statements in terms of what I see as the impact would be. So here's a series of 6 tweets that occurred in mid-April. And if we could start with the one in the bottom right, the proposed new provincial policy statement will force municipalities to allow up to 3 new residential lots per farm parcel and 2 accessory residential units on each of these new parcels, a radical shift in 50 years of planning for agricultural lands in Ontario. And by radical, I don't mean positive. Above that, in the 1970s, Ontario released countryside planning, food land guidelines. Both championed agriculture over residential sprawl. Variations of this policy guided planning for 50 years in Ontario. And what we have in front of us will introduce much uncertainty. And I will say that it guided policy in this Ontario under the Bill Davis government when it was first brought out, under successive Conservative and NDP and Liberal governments, all having supported this direction in policy in Ontario. Third tweet above that, while Greenbelt plans, while Greenbelt changes caused much concern, the province's proposed new PPS agricultural severance policy is in many ways much worse. If I had space, I would have said much, much worse. It will allow hundreds of thousands of new lots and many more residences scattered amongst farms. And you saw that data from Pam. How will agriculture cope in this new reality? Above that, on a typical concession block, the proposed new PPS will allow at least 30 new residential lots. With MDS, there will be virtually no space for growth in the livestock sector. Indeed, we should ask the question, is this the beginning of the end for animal agriculture in Ontario? Those are from an agricultural perspective. On the left-hand side, 2 additional tweets just to introduce some other topics, which I don't think have been given due consideration. I wonder if MTO has given thought to the PPS proposed severance policy for agricultural areas. Given 2 sides of a provincial highway and 5 farms on each side, this could result in up to 30 requests for new entrance permits and a concession road frontage per 1.25 miles. So again, 5 farms, 3 lots, 5 parcels, traditionally 5 farms, 3 lots per parcel. You can see where the 30 would come from. Again, changes in speed limits, safety with vehicles, all kinds of issues. And I also wonder from an aggregates perspective, agriculture and aggregates often share the same space. As the province examined revised PPS impacts on aggregates, similar to agriculture, sterilization of the resource and challenges of establishing in the midst of an agricultural area with up to 90 new residences per concession block. And those residences are a function of the severances plus the additional dwelling units that have been referred to previously. So again, I think each of these are statements that need to be thought about seriously in terms of their impact on agriculture and other elements of the rural community as well. Next slide, please. I've included this slide just to demonstrate how agriculture has changed over my lifetime. And we can see the examples that are included here. Sometimes folks will refer to agriculture as an industrial activity. I tend to not use that, but many of the processes are in fact industrial in nature. And we can see a large grain facility in the top picture. We can see animal housing, and we can see the extent of investment that occurs on farms these days. And I've also included, notwithstanding that many of my comments are directed to impacts on livestock production, I've included, for example, some of the new technologies being used in crop production. So you can imagine, in this case, a drone. You can also imagine people in tender fruit areas using bird bangers, all kinds of issues that modern agriculture uses as part of their production systems to remain economic and viable, which I don't believe work well with a lot of residences around them. Next slide, please. So I've spent much of my career thinking about the future of agriculture, and I can see we've got a little issue here with the slide, but in the past, we would have issues of productivity, and we've gone through a pattern, again, over my lifetime of anticipating that there will be continuing and ongoing increases in productivity. But if we think about the future of agriculture, we can anticipate that the future might be increased productivity. It might be productivity very similar to what we have now, but I think there are reasons, and we'll just look at some of these issues all the way from new technologies to water use and climate change that might lead to a decrease in productivity. But if we look at the next, just hit the next button there. Slide comes up. I would never have thought that our provincial land use policy could be such a threat to the future of agriculture in Ontario. And I would say, notwithstanding the province's interest in increasing productivity in the farms, I think that what we have in front of us will significantly and negatively impact productivity in terms of the farmer's ability to produce, to do so in an environment where there's support from the community and support from the industry. I think there's some real challenges that will impact productivity moving forward. Next slide, please. So just a few stats here. I won't spend too much time on them. And Pam has already touched on some of these, but we have a certain number of farms in Ontario, 48,000, and those farms on average tend to have access to 3.5 parcels that they're using to farm. Some of those are owned by farmers, some of those are owned by non-farmers who rent it and are therefore one of the parcels that would be eligible. And we anticipate that there's roughly at least 170,000 parcels that would be eligible for these severances. If you apply 3 severances and you assume that they're 1 lot each, which I think is the absolute minimum, I think the average is likely to be closer to 1.5 to 2. That number of at least 500,000 acres would be taken out of agricultural production as a result of these severances if it was continued through to its full extent. I think the impact, and we'll talk about that in more detail in a second, is much greater than that because we have implications coming from those people living in the countrysides in terms of minimum distance separation formula, and again, the farmer's ability to farm essentially. So not only will we see the loss of farmland, I think will impact farmers in many ways. I was driving through Perth County last week and I was observing farmers doing the things that farmers are doing on busy days when they are out planting. Large equipment going down the roads, mailboxes that they had to navigate. I'm seeing, the application of herbicides, a whole variety of things that are occurring in that context, large livestock facilities and so on. So the impacts will range from land values to trespass to road safety to concerns over manure application and so on. We have a limited amount of agricultural land in Ontario, and we're already losing to more planned urban expansions, 319 acres of farmland every day. Next slide, please. So we've known about this for a long time. We've known how to plan in these kinds of environments. And this is an image from the 1976 document Countryside Planning, which if anyone's interested is on my website. And in the top slide, the top image on the right-hand side, we can see the impact of scattered non-farm residential residences. They have a cone of influence, if you like, where limited activity can occur in terms of livestock facilities. So each of those severances creates limitations on the farm community that surrounds it. And on the bottom right, in contrast, we can see the positive impact of compressing that development into our towns and villages. And again, we've known this for 50 years, and we've planned around this environment in that context. Next slide, please. So just looking at this particular image, it may seem funny. Notice this property is a farm, farms have animals. Animals make funny sounds, smell bad, and have sex outdoors. Unless you can tolerate noise, odors, and outdoor sex, don't buy property next to a farm. My concern is that that farm voice that has made that statement is at risk of being lost. At risk of being lost in 2 ways: absolute numbers, but also it becomes such a small component of the farm community with the number of severances that are being proposed in the midst of agricultural land. Next slide, please. So I've spent a lot of time over my career working with severances in my days with Huron County and helping people to understand policy, and then doing research on it subsequent to that. And in this particular slide, it's capturing research that we did in 2 separate time periods, looking at the 1990s and looking at the 2010s, at the 2000s. We're doing another study, not yet complete, looking at this current past decade. And what we're seeing in front of us here are the severances that were granted on agricultural designations, and that's the red slide. So that would include residential lot severances, which is the green, but it would include farm splits. It would include limited institutional uses that might occur in the countryside and so on. But what we can see in that bottom is that in that time period, in agricultural designations in rural Ontario, we had 21,000 severances for new lots being created, and 16,475 of those were for residential purposes. Those would be the surplus dwellings, retirement lot severances, and so on. And the next slide will help us understand that a little bit more. Next slide, please. So this is the details for surplus and retirement lot severances that occurred between 1990 and 2010. The blue line are surplus dwelling severances, which have been permitted and continue to be permitted in most of rural Ontario. And the red line are retirement lot severances, which were allowed under provincial policy up to the period of time, 2005. And in 2005, the PPS at that time was changed to eliminate that type of severance. And a variety of reasons why that was done. Often farmers don't retain those lands for very long once they retire. We had a situation in Niagara region where a farmer had retired 12 or 13 times and applied for severance each time. So people were seeing abuses of the policy, and it was removed. As a result, we saw with the change in provincial policy, retirement lot severances essentially dropped to 0. Next slide, please. Prior to 2005, severances were also permitted for farm help and for infill lots. Infill lots being where you've got a house here and a house there previously severed, and there's some opportunity to create another lot in between those two because it was of limited value to agriculture. And those types of severance farm help lots had largely dropped off to 0 as it was before 2005. but policy changed it to eliminate them completely after that. Likewise, we see infill lots, which were changed in 2005 to not be permitted any longer. The end result was that we're left primarily only with surplus dwelling severances on farmland. Next slide, please. So when we put that data together, and this is covering a 20-year time period from 1990 through to 2009, we looked at what were the typical numbers on a per concession block throughout Ontario. And what you see here are the extremes from the low, which is a value of 0.08 in Perth County in the sort of bottom center, to a high of 7.55 in Prince Edward and 6.78 in Essex County. And those were the numbers that we saw. Now, what that means is that at the start of the decade, at the start of that 20-year time period, a farmer in Perth County had limited restrictions on their ability to farm in terms of MDS and things of that nature. And at the end of 20 years, they had virtually no additional restrictions being established. Whereas in the other two jurisdictions, there was significant severance activity that changed things. Let's look a little bit further at the next slide, and we'll see that in a bit more detail. Just to point out before I get to that next slide, though, is that we have significant livestock production occurring within Ontario, and that includes the dairy, the beef, the hog sector, poultry as well, and other values as well in terms of other farm types. But really looking at the importance and the significance of the agricultural sector to Ontario's economy. Next slide, please. So going back to those two numbers, Perth County versus Prince Edward County, what does this look like in practice? And on the right-hand side, you can see again that the 0.08 severances per 1,000 acres, which means you would need roughly 20,000 acres for one severance. That was the rate that they were being granted at. The farmers in Perth County, and that's that little blue triangle, that would be the amount of additional land that came under restriction if a farmer was wanting to establish a hog operation of 2,000 feeder hogs. And if we look at the value in Prince Edward County, of course, many more severances, assuming they were randomly distributed, you see a much greater area coming under restriction or under limitation, additional limitations, because there would already be some houses there, additional limitations that would impact the ability to produce and have livestock within that community. And we see that in patterns on the land in terms of Perth County, that strong agriculture and livestock sector, many other counties. And if we went back and looked at the severances, we would see at Oxford, Huron, Bruce, Middlesex, all with relatively low severances as an example, reflective of the kind of industry that they have there. Let's look at the next slide, please. So the question is, if we proceed with the severances that the province is proposing to allow, I should say almost force upon municipalities in the policy, allowing 30 severances, what would be the implications? And this is taking and establishing a cone of influence for each of those 30 lots that have now been created, and it would look like this, with the area being defined, which is restricted essentially for again, a 2,000 feeder hog operation at distance of 552 meters. If a farmer was wanting to establish a 4,000 feeder hog operation, which is often being built these days, you can see that would be 700 meters, virtually no space left, even in the middle of a concession block. And if we're looking at a dairy cow operation, much less intensive in terms of odors and so on, even a 100 cow dairy operation would require a 300-meter setback. We are truly locking ourselves into a pattern that would be absolutely contrary, in my view, to the best interests of agriculture. Next slide, please. I just want to go back to the slide that Pam showed earlier. And again, to reflect upon this slide, if you were to establish those blue circles around those lots. And I will point out that those lots are not the severances. Those are simply the lots that are eligible for severances. The number of severances could potentially be 3 times the number of dots that we're seeing on that map. And establishing each of those having a cone of influence in terms of MDS. I had a reporter ask me a question. She said, so is MDS the problem? And I said, no, MDS is not the problem. MDS is a tool that we use to make sure that farms, livestock facilities, and residents are at a distance adequate to hopefully ensure that they get along. It's all of those residences that create the issue, not only for livestock production, but for other forms of agriculture as well. And we'll hear, I'm sure, in our question and answer from folks from other sectors. Next slide, please. So just in summary, there's 3 or 4 things here just to make sure. Let's also talk about aggregates. Let's talk about water availability and safety. Let's talk about natural heritage, because all of these things have are impacted by the severances that are being suggested. Small towns and villages, what does it mean now for a developer wanting to build in a small town or village when all of this much much of this development can occur at much lesser standards in terms of services which will be provided. And what does it mean for school boards, servicing, and so on? Next slide, please. And again, I'll just pose these questions. They're likely going to come up in our discussion. What will agriculture look like? What about wells and water? What about the livestock production? What about aggregates? What about affordable housing? What does it mean for agricultural land values? And what land use conflicts will be created from this policy? Next slide, and I have one final comment. So I just want to bring us back to my friend, the burly, aggressive farmer. If he was with us today, what would he be saying? And the first thing I think he would, if we were at a meeting talking about this, there would be 4 things he'd want to share with us. The first is that he's mad as the proverbial, right? The second is he would say, this is an attack on agriculture. The third thing he would say is that rural and small town and agriculture will never be the same in the province. And the fourth thing he would do is he would stand up and he would say, this is not a good plan. What are you thinking? Thanks for listening to my, hope it wasn't too much of a rant, but listening to my comments, because I just think this is so fundamental for all of us who have an interest in agriculture.
Wonderful. Thank you, Wayne and Pam, so much for this presentation. We're going to dive right into the questions now. Again, if you have any questions for either Wayne or Pam or Margaret as well, please put them into the question and answer feature within the Zoom webinar. And if you see another question that you would also like answered, you can click the thumbs up in order to upvote that question so we get to it sooner rather than later, as we do have a limited time. So I'll dive right into the question period. The first one that I have for you is, I'm curious what thought, if any, has been given to the number of new wells and septics that would be created with these new lots. What impact that could have on groundwater and potential impacts to neighboring wells? Is the Clean Water Act being thought of here?
Pam and I are probably both looking at each other to decide who wants to respond. So if you want to go ahead, Pam, go ahead.
I would say, Martin and Wayne, those are very good questions, and I don't know the answer at this time. All that we have before us is the proposed new provincial planning statement. We don't know where the details of those policies have come from, what's been reviewed, what's been researched, what's been looked at in detail. So I don't have the answer to that at this time.
What I will simply add is we have a guesstimate of what the numbers could be, because we anticipate that there's probably at least the possibility for 500,000 of these units to be established. We assume they will be on private water. We assume they will be on septic tank. And we know through experience that wells and septic tanks need to have appropriate amount of space to function properly. So I would just have to think that from my perspective, it is a concern.
Thank you both. The next question, almost all of us would agree that the proposed changes will have a negative effect and accelerate the loss of valuable farmland. The question is, what is the most effective way to pressure the province to walk these policies back? Petitions and rallies don't seem to be working on other areas like saving the Greenbelt. So what strategies can be developed that are more effective? Should we be looking at successes of other jurisdictions? What else would work?
I've spent a fair bit of my time talking with and working with the farm organizations and made a number of presentations. And I think that the farm organizations have a large voice. And my hope is that perhaps that voice, because it represents an electoral base for the province, they might pay attention to it. Margaret, Pam, feel free to jump in on that. I think the person has hit a good challenge.
I think one thing that people, you know, having worked in agriculture all my life, I'm always struck by how little people actually know about it or what it needs to function efficiently. And I think part of the thing we need to tell people is, if you continue to want to have Ontario peaches, tomatoes, you know, dairy, milk supply. Someone once said to me actually I was a surgeon from Guelph, that Canada is the Switzerland of food. We have safe, reliable, wonderful food. And I think if you say to people what this will do is eliminate that will resonate. But you need to make them understand that we can't just move agriculture up to Sudbury. So that's where I think we can make and strike a chord.
Thank you. So I have the next question as well. There's a couple that I might merge together as I see they're somewhat similar. So how will being a farm in the Greenbelt affect the opportunity for lot severances, or can lot severances be applied within the Greenbelt? Along those same lines, we do have another question similar to the Niagara Escarpment.
So I've had conversations with folks which lead me to understand that within the Greenbelt, the expectation is that the current provincial policy in the Greenbelt would trump the provincial policy statement. And that comes from folks with the province that I've had chats with. What that policy looks like in the future, as we might see revisions to the Greenbelt plan, however, I think historically the province has tried to merge the two sets of policy so that they're not contradictory to each other. So it will be quite interesting to see how that evolves. And I know, Margaret, you do a lot of work in the Greenbelt area. I don't know if you have any further observations in that from what you've picked up or not.
Well, from what I've picked up, it seems that the Greenbelt plan is supposed to continue to trump the PPS. But what I also was struck by was a lack of any mention of the Niagara Escarpment plan or the Oak Ridges Moraine plan. So how that's factoring in. And frankly, as we've seen this series of changes come down, I wouldn't be surprised if there's something else that may, I don't think we should be complacent about the fact that the Greenbelt plan will not be unchanged.
Agreed.
The next question is my understanding that official plans can be more restrictive than the PPS. Would this remain the same with restricting new lots on prime ag?
So I can jump in on this one, Martin. My quick answer would be no. And I think the policy that you could be looking at is 4.3.32, which says official plans and zoning bylaws shall not contain provisions that are more restrictive, except to address public health or safety concerns.
Right, yes. Thanks, Pam. Planning language can be technical and difficult to understand or interpret. What plain language resources would you recommend sharing with the general public about this issue? For example, an explainer video would be an invaluable tool to help underscore the impacts of this proposed policy visually and what it means for food production. An excellent question, Kristen, a challenging one that we try to tackle every day.
What I would say is the best strategy is probably to listen, it's to learn, it's to speak to folks. And it is challenging because some of them, many members of the public will never have heard of what the provincial policy statement or the provincial planning statement is, right? So I think that's why I like to try to incorporate stories, because I think people can resonate with stories in a way that they might not resonate with stats. And the visuals that Pam brought to her, the presentation as well, especially the map from Middlesex County, is just like how can anyone not look at that change and not have their jaw drop, right? So I think it's to use some of those visuals, stories where they're possible, and speak to people would be a suggestion I would have.
And I would agree with Wayne's comments, Martin. I would also say that, I think, we need to continue to talk about this and use plain language that we deal with every day as farmers. And I think, one of those comments that I've heard from farmers is, at first impression, this seems like a good idea personally for many farmers, right? It may have the abilities to help financially. Farming is not a cheap thing to do. We all know that. And it could definitely assist on a personal level. But when you start looking at the policy context across Ontario, within our own municipalities, and the ripple effects that this will have, I think that's the dialogue that we need to continue having, and what these policies mean for the long term of agriculture in Ontario.
And I would add to that, I think the most compelling stories, and I think Wayne did a great job with some of his stories about the farmers, is listen to the farmers. I mean, they're the ones who will tell you. And I find it interesting that the timing on this, I mean, this is the busiest time of year for farmers and not the best time for to be engaging. But I think if we listen to the farmers and make it clear and straightforward, as planners, we all know that when we start to talk, sometimes people's eyes just cross. But I do think we need to keep it simple. And things like, the climate that's south of that's created by the Niagara Escarpment and the Oak Ridges Moraine, you can't replace climate. I had a peach farmer in Niagara tell me that. He said, we can't do that. We can do all kinds of things. We cannot replicate climate. So just keeping those facts straight, and people do value local food. It's a huge thing in urban areas. We just need to connect the dots for them. This is just a really bad thing.
I will ask one more question, then we will be getting short on time just before our wrap up. So the last question that I have for the panelists is, what tools do municipalities and planners have to push back on the province's proposal? How does a professional planner uphold their code of conduct and ethics when you are dealing with a policy regime that does not align with your professional opinion?
It was interesting. I did a presentation to several municipalities over the last week and a half, and one of the municipalities coming out of the meeting was embarking upon not only submitting comments to the registry, but also contacting the ministers directly, to their local MPPs, making sure that people that are out there, to the media, they were doing on their own a whole variety of things to try to raise the profile of this. And I think that that's part of the challenge, is to get, if we simply submit our comments and it's one of 500 comments expressing concern, I could see them getting dismissed, to be quite honest. I think though, when you make personal contacts with people and specifically ask for their response, I know other councils I was speaking to were going to invite their local MPPs to their council meetings. I think there's those kinds of things that one might do. I'll let Pam and Margaret weigh in, and I heard the questions well about OPPI.
Yeah, I'll try to answer that part, Martin. I would say, you know, as a registered professional planner, one thing that I can do is really look at the details of the policy. And we tried to do that at the front end of this presentation and ask questions to the province on, what does this mean? What does that mean? How does this work? Because the details are, the devil is really in the details of the policy, right? And you know, my expertise is in on-farm diversification, and I've seen in southwestern Ontario, property owners try to expand policies in terms of on-farm diversification and really in terms of what a farm is. And I can see those boundaries continuing to be pushed. So again, the devil is in the details. We really need to ask questions to the province on what the words mean in the policies.
Well, and I am very sympathetic to my colleagues, because I understand it's a very, very difficult position. I mean, it's good for me. I'm in the process of retiring. I'm retired basically, so I can say what I want now, which I think is a good thing. So Wayne and I will have to bear the brunt of this, but I just want to say to all of my colleagues on the phone, you have my sympathy.
Thank you all.
I might add to that too. There will be, if this were to go ahead, there will be very challenging times ahead of us, right? And I think part of our onus as planners will be to work with our elected officials, the councils, to try to find ways to minimize the impact of this as much as we can. And whether it means diving into those words, what does lower priority mean, and trying to, like, just don't, my comment would be for municipalities and for planners not to roll over to this in the event that the province unfortunately were to proceed with it. I think that, you know, part of the times ahead of us will be to find how do we minimize the impact as best as we can, if we can, but not to roll over and not put up an argument, if I could put it that way.
Fun addition. Thanks, Wayne. I know that there are numerous other questions that are still to get at, and unfortunately we are running short on time. If you have a question that is still outstanding and you'd like one of us to address that, you can send your questions to info@ontariofarmlandtrust.ca, and I'm going to be sending that out into the group chat right now, so everybody has access to that email address. So I do apologize if you can't get to all the great questions that I see here, but of course, if you would like to follow up with us and if we can be of any assistance in answering those questions, please contact us at info@ontariofarmlandtrust.ca.
If I might ask, Martin, today's session is going to be posted on your website, is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So I'm going to hand the floor back over to Margaret. Thank you all.
Well, thank you very much, Pam and Wayne. This was amazing, and thank you so much for your time and your passion. So now we want you all to take action. We're here to help you to any extent that we possibly can. And so we have prepared, as Martin said, an action page on our website, and there's a link in the chat where you can access it. So we really want you to contact your MPPs. We've prepared a letter that you can use add a video message, use it as a template and add your own personal comments, engage with your farm community, engage with people, with the public to educate them. Outreach makes a huge difference. And I think we have seen in the past, this government does respond to a strong public outcry. We also appreciate your support and efforts in our programming. If you found this webinar useful, we would ask you consider making a pay what you can donation to the Ontario Farmland Trust so we can continue our advocacy work on policy and continue to provide these seminars. You can make a donation on our website, which the link will be on the screen, and it will be added to the chat as well. Finally, please share what you've learned today with your family, your friends, your neighbors, anyone else in your network. Share the link with the MPP letter so that people can write in. Remain up to date on our progress. If you would like to join us, we would love to have you come. So keep in touch with the Farmland Trust. And if you have skills you can add, we have always got openings for members on our committee and any interest in the board. So we are on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. So thank you. Thank you so much once again for taking your time to listen and to ask questions, and let's keep the good dialogue going. And once again, a huge thank you to Wayne Caldwell and Pam Duesling for their work on this. So I think we've made it right on time. So have a great day and let's work on this together. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Margaret, Wayne, and Pam. Take care.